US election special webinar. My name is Freddy Colquhoun. I'm an investment director here at JM Fin. And I'm delighted to introduce a good friend of JM Fin, namely Freddy Gray. Freddy Gray is going to be here for the next hour, and we're going to discuss many of the aspects of the current campaigning between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. Freddy is an expert in US politics. He has been the deputy editor of the Spectator magazine since 2014. He is normally the man on the ground in America, particularly when it comes to US election campaigns. He's followed Donald Trump through his 2016 campaign and the 2020 campaign. And Freddy has just come back from the Democratic National Congress. So he's in a good position to give us his assessment on the state of the race and also, how things might evolve over the next few months and into the new year as well. And we're going to discuss the implications for geopolitics, implications for markets, and also, probably most importantly, implications for the American people as well. So we have an hour, and we are able to also take some of your questions. If you feel like you've got some burning questions, then do email them across. Email them to marketing@jmfin.com, and we will have some time towards the end of the webinar to ask Freddy some of your questions as well. So without further ado, let's kick off and ask Freddy for his assessment, your current assessment, Freddy, of the state of the race as you see it, particularly after the DNC.
Well, I was at Chicago for the DNC, the Democratic National Convention, and political conventions are always very strange events. But I felt this one was particularly weird because Kamala Harris has gone from being a vice president that was widely acknowledged as being a liability and unpopular to suddenly being widely billed as the hottest political phenomenon on the planet. And I thought it was very strange speaking to delegates that they couldn't really say what they liked about her, but they would say they were very excited about her. And if you ask them why, it was because she's a woman or it was because she's not Donald Trump. And so the great enthusiasm behind her is really based on the fact she's not Donald Trump. And I really think she can win this election because she is not Donald Trump and she's not Joe Biden. And if she wins, that will be the real reason why. But as for the state of the race, I think it's extremely tight. It's always extremely tight. And just before coming on, I looked it up. Yesterday was Labor Day in America. And historically, people say only really look at the polls after Labor Day, because that's when things really tighten up, when people are really focusing on the election. And if you go back to 2016, first week of September in 2016, Hillary Clinton was on about 42%. Whereas Donald Trump was on 39%, so about 3-4 points behind. If you look at 2020, Trump was about 10 points behind Biden at this stage, so a much more significant gap. And then now, with Harris rising in the polls, Trump is about 3 percentage points behind. So he's actually in his strongest position of any presidential election he's done, which would suggest that if according to form, you would expect Trump to win according to the fundamentals. However, we have this extremely strange situation of Kamala Harris coming in as a kind of clean slate and this strange combination of being a continuity candidate and a change candidate. So she's presenting herself as somebody new, while at the same time saying she's going to carry on Biden's legacy. And this works for some Democrats because they think we actually like everything about Biden. The problem with Biden was Biden himself and his old age and obvious decline. So I think a lot of people are now seeing her as somebody who can just be a vessel, a vehicle for Bidenomics, for the Biden agenda, which a lot of Democrats say they like. The question is whether the rest of the country likes it. And there was a very interesting thing that happened after the convention, which was that I'm sure lots of people will have seen it, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who was running as an independent candidate, came out and endorsed Trump. He said actually he'd stay in the race in states where he's on the ballot, but in swing states he encouraged people to vote for Trump. Now the percentage of his support is quite minimal, and the number of people who will actually listen to him when he endorses Trump is very debatable. However, this race is going to be very, very close, and in those crucial swing states, RFK Jr. could make a big difference. Those few thousand voters. This election is going to be decided by a few thousand voters in a few swing states. And I think RFK's intervention possibly pushed the balance back in favor of Donald Trump. The big problem for Harris is that she's untested, unknown. People don't know what she believes, and so on, even though she tried to introduce herself to the nation at the convention. She did do this CNN interview last week to sort of answer the question of the fact she's been ducking interviews, which she has been. She's been refusing to be interviewed by the press, which is an extraordinary thing. And I thought the CNN interview was quite bland. It wasn't a cock up. There were no big slips. She just talked in vague terms about values and so on. So the question is, can her pop-up campaign that has just sort of appeared get all the way to November without a major slip-up, without exposing her shallowness in terms of policy? And do voters hate Donald Trump enough to believe in her? And the polls at the moment suggest that they do.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And as you say, there's an argument to say that a lot of the American voters have already made up their minds. And what we thought was quite interesting is that after the DNC, you didn't necessarily see too much of a jump in the poll ratings for Kamala Harris as to what you might have expected. And that perhaps then solidifies that argument to say that it will just boil down to, as it always does, it seems, some of those swing states and a few 100,000 voters. So when looking at the swing states, and perhaps we can mention her interesting pick of VP candidate here as well. What are going to be the key swing states for both candidates to get enough electoral votes for both of them?
Well, at the moment, it looks like the key swing states are Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania in the north, and then Georgia and Arizona in the south. At the moment, Harris is nudging ahead in Michigan. She's nudging quite, not significantly, but significantly by the tight stands of this race in Wisconsin. And it's very tight in Pennsylvania. Trump still seems to have the edge. Obviously, it depends which average you look at, but still seems to have the edge in Georgia and Arizona. So what you might see is Harris winning back the Rust Belt, as it's called, the Midwest states, and Trump keeping the Sun Belt, those southern states. If that happens, Harris wins. But again, it's so tight. All these polls are so tight. And I think what you'll see is what they call an October surprise. We had it with Hillary Clinton and her emails in 2016. There wasn't really one in 2020, but an October surprise where a news event, it can be an international crisis. It can be something that either exposes Trump's weaknesses or Harris's weaknesses. Something like that could swing the vote in those states. And if you look at them individually, you look at Wisconsin, the abortion issue seems to be particularly prominent there. And the abortion issue is a big win for the Democrats. Because Donald Trump undid Roe v. Wade, so the Supreme Court voted for Dobbs, which reversed Roe v. Wade. And ever since then, in all special elections, Republicans have struggled. Whatever you think of the morality of the issue of abortion, electorally, it's been a loser for the Republicans, which is why Trump is now making quite almost pro-choice, pro-abortion noises, just to try and signal that he is not this pro-life extremist. So Wisconsin, I think abortion will be key. In Michigan, it's really interesting because there's a big Arab vote there. And the Democrats are in a difficult position because the left of their party is very pro-Palestine, and they are very angry with their party for supporting Israel. If there's more drama in Israel, which it looks almost certain as though there's going to be, and the Democrats continue to fully support Israel, then they could lose votes among a large Arab community in Michigan. But I think they'll probably get away with doing what they have been doing, which is talking out of both sides on their mouth, saying we support Israel, but there has to be a ceasefire. And, positioning a bit like the Labour Party in Britain, positioning themselves as pro-Israel, but also listening to the disgruntlement there is on the left of their party and from the Arab communities.
Yeah, so it is going to be the focus on the swing states. And so again, with regards to her VP pick, and Waltz is obviously coming under a little bit of fire at the moment. But were you surprised that they went for Waltz in the end?
I was a little. I thought they were going to go with Josh Shapiro, who's the governor of Pennsylvania, and that would have been a more kind of tactical pick because it would help them win Pennsylvania. He's popular in Pennsylvania. But again, the Gaza issue came up there a lot because Shapiro is Jewish. He's very, very vocally pro-Israel. And I think there was a lot of backlash from the left of the party about his possible coming in. Waltz is not exactly shy about being pro-Israel, but he's a much sort of softer figure on international affairs, and he's a much more ambiguous figure on international affairs. And I think that's one of the reasons he was picked. At first, it looked like being a very, very successful nomination, the Waltz pick, particularly because J.D. Vance, Donald Trump's pick, has had a very rough time in the media. There's lots of clips of him talking about childless cat ladies and saying very unacceptable things on social media and on podcasts and so on. And so I think a lot of Republicans were feeling slightly in despair about J.D. Vance. And Waltz, who's very personable, he's got this sort of clubbable, likable, affable, avuncular persona. He came across very well. However, there are two things that have come up since then that are showing that perhaps he wasn't such a smart pick. One is that he seems to have lied about his military record. He said he was in Afghanistan. He said he fought in the Operation Enduring Freedom. In fact, he was a sort of reservist who was based in Italy. And particularly among veterans, the idea of stolen valor, of pretending to have had some impressive military record that you don't have, is a really sore point. And I think the sheen has come off him slightly because of that. And the other thing that he has fibbed about is that he said he and his wife had a child through IVF. And this was thought to be an important debating point when he and Vance have to face each other in a debate this month. This would be an important kind of clash point because he would say to J.D. Vance, your Catholic Christian beliefs mean that you won't accept that I had my family, and the way in which I had my family is unacceptable to you. And it was thought that would be a good emotional point to make in the debate. However, the fact that he's fibbed about it, he didn't actually have IVF. He had something called IUI, which is, I don't want to get into the technicalities of it, but it's different. It's not the same thing. So he has this track record of sort of lying when it suits him politically. And I think everyone thought that in debate, Waltz would wipe the floor with Vance. But Vance is actually, for all his flaws, is a very, very intelligent man. He's a very good debater. I think that debate could be crucial because if Vance can kind of show Waltz up to be a fraud, and if Waltz loses his temper, which he has a record of doing, that could be important. And I tend to think that presidential, vice presidential debates aren't that important. They don't seem to move the dial. But because this election is so strange, I think that the next presidential debate on September 10th is coming up between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump will be very important. And I think the vice presidential debate will be it'd be fascinating to watch, to see who wins. And because particularly with Vance, when you think about Trump, everybody knows Trump is 78. He's not getting any younger. Vance will be the leader of his movement. So a lot of people will be looking towards him and thinking, what will happen when Trump goes? What will happen to the Republican Party? What exactly are they voting for? Are they voting for this Christian nationalist party that the Democrats say they are? Or are they voting for somebody that supports the working classes and, blue collar people in Rust Belt states, which is what the Republicans want to present?
Yeah, and sort of moving on to the presidential debate, which, as you said, is next week, next Tuesday. It's going to be very interesting to see how both Harris and Trump approach the debate, and each other, of course, because it seems like since Harris became the presidential candidate for the Dems, that he hasn't been that sure as to how to attack her. And, he calls her a left-wing radical, and, Vance went at her as well with regards to her family. But, are we going to be hearing from Harris that he's weird? What are the kind of key phrases that we're going to hear? Is it left-wing radical for Harris? Is it weirdness for the attack line on Trump? Or is it going to be more focused on the policy?
Well, there's a growing theory, and it's not just among people that don't like Trump. There's a growing theory that Trump has lost some of his potency since the shooting. Obviously, you had this extraordinary event, which seemed to just solidify him as this historic figure. There's the photo of him after being shot. His ear was clipped after being shot, saying fight, fight, fight. That iconic image. And everybody thought that's going to be the photo that wins Donald Trump this election. However, he has been acting slightly strangely since then. He's been flailing a bit more than usual. And you have to be careful about this because a lot of times when you read about Trump having a meltdown or Trump losing the plot, it's usually Democratic propaganda. But I've speaking to a lot of Republicans, I think they are concerned about the way he's behaving, and they are concerned about how he will be on stage with Kamala Harris. Going back to that debate at the end of June between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, one of the reasons Trump, who's not a very good debater, it should be said, one of the reasons he really, really trounced Biden in that debate was because they ordered the microphones. The Democrats insisted that the microphones were turned off. And this was in an attempt to shut Trump up, really, because he has a tendency to shout over his opponent. But actually, that worked out brilliantly for Trump because Biden just had plenty of room to hang himself. And there was that devastating line where Trump said, "I don't know what he's saying. I don't think he knows what he's saying either." And that was the kind of killer moment in that debate. And Trump is good at those one-liners. He's just not very good at, in-depth policy discussions. I don't think Harris is a particularly good debater either. She was famously thrashed by Tulsi Gabbard in 2020 on the bigger debate stage in the Democratic primary. She has a slightly nauseating way of saying, "I'm speaking," when she's being interrupted. And in her debate against Mike Pence in 2020, she said, "Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking." And a lot of Democrats thought that was a killer line. I'm not sure it was. And she has this tendency of doing it. She was interrupted by some Gaza protests recently. And she said, "You can carry on saying that if you want Donald Trump, but for now, I'm speaking." And I think she thinks it's some sort of devastating put down, but I think it makes her sound sort of schoolmarmish and slightly irritating. And so I think what you're going to see is two not very likable personalities clashing on stage. I suspect Kamala Harris will be smart enough. She is a prosecutor. I don't think she's the greatest brain in the world, but she does have some rhetorical abilities when she's not sort of left to her own devices too much. She'll be extremely well prepped. She'll stick to the script. I think she's been told not to cackle because a lot of people find her laugh quite annoying. And she's obviously restrained her laugh in a couple of instances recently. So I think she could get away with just letting Trump, letting Trump be the bully, particularly if the Democrats get their way, which is they want to unmute the microphones and let Donald Trump be this sort of rampaging lunatic that he can be. Because it's thought, particularly if he shouts over a woman, a lot of women voters are going to find that deeply obnoxious. And I think as a result, Trump could end up making a fool of himself, particularly given current form. But you just never know with Donald Trump. You never know quite who's going to come out. He can be quite impressively across the detail when you least expect it. He can be quite civilized and kind when you least expect it. And I've spoken to people who've advised Trump about his debating style. And Trump thinks that the reason he won that debate against Biden was not just because Biden was so bad, all the microphones. It was because he restrained himself. And so if Trump is able to restrain himself, then it's a different matter. But as I say, I think this debate is going to be so crucial in ways that I don't think presidential debates usually are.
And if you were on the Trump campaign team at the moment, would you be advising him to try and stick to script, or would you sort of perhaps say Donald, just be Donald? Because it seems like he gets more attention and perhaps more support when he does go slightly off the rails, and moves away into areas of controversy.
Well, that's exactly it. I think his advisors are encouraging him to stick to the policies. They think Kamala, the communist, brand her as an extreme left winger, talk about her record, talk about her failures, which are significant. But Trump instinctively is rebelling against that. And he thinks he's got to do his Trump thing, which has worked for him in the past, which is to be incredibly rude. The problem is he doesn't seem to be able to settle on a name for her. He tried to call her Kamala Crash when there was a dip in the stock markets. He's Kamala the Communist. Kambala he came up, which is not one of his better ones. And this speaks to this idea that he's lost a little bit of his mojo since the shooting. I mean, it would affect anyone, I think, being shot at. And he seems to be less punchy. He's lost some of that amazing, exuberant turbulence that he often displays. I think he is a little bit wrong-footed by Kamala, partly because she is such an empty vessel, and you can call her Kamala the Communist as much as you want, but everybody sort of knows that Kamala Harris doesn't really stand for anything. And, in her record, she's taken different positions on almost every issue, and she's an empty vessel. She's not an ideologically driven person. So the Republicans and Trump have to present something a little bit more nuanced, which is that she's an empty vessel, but behind her there'll be this radical left agenda. And the question is whether they can persuade the American public of that. I don't think the American public have paid enough attention to Kamala Harris to go along with that. That's why I'm slightly thinking Kamala Harris might get away with victory.
So when it comes to policy, let's really dive in a little bit to sort of comparing and contrasting both candidates, because over the last few weeks, it does seem as if Harris has tried to move slightly more into the centre ground and away from a few of her previous policy positions. That being said, she has come out with policies that do look quite left-wing from an American perspective. The comments on price gouging, taxing unrealized gains on investments as well. It does seem to be a little bit more radical than what Biden was proposing. But then on the flip side, you see Donald Trump sort of doing Donald Trump ×2 again with tax reductions, corporate tax cuts as well, and deregulation as well. So it does seem like there is quite a stark choice now for the American public. What's your take on the sort of moving into the centre ground from Kamala's perspective, but also what about Donald Trump's policies? Is it just a rehash of what we saw before with him?
Well, on Harris, I think it's that continuity change thing again. So she's trying to present herself as an agent of change while being the continuity of Bidenomics person. So she's, the price gouging thing got a lot of attention. It seemed that she was causing for price controls. Republicans were saying these are price controls. They've already rode back on that slightly and suggested that's not what her intention is at all. The only sort of new ideas she seems to be suggesting are housing, which is again similar to the Labour Party, and there are interesting points of comparison between Labour and Kamala Harris. There's housing, giving people support, $25,000 loans for their first-time buyers. These are potentially quite significant things, but they don't amount to a comprehensive vision. And if you look at her website, there are still no policies on her website, which is absolutely extraordinary. Normally by now, yes, it's true to say that Americans don't really think that deeply about policies, and their elections tend to be all about personality and charisma and razzmatazz and so on, and that's all true. But most presidential, in fact, all serious presidential candidates have a very detailed policy platform by now, and Kamala Harris just simply doesn't have one. What she's keen to do is to point the finger at Donald Trump and say Donald Trump is going to be an extremist, which of course a lot of people believe. And the Democrats are pointing a lot towards Project 2025, which is a project by the Heritage Foundation, which had some pretty radical ideas about abortion, about the economy, and about education as well. Pretty conservative ideas in there. A lot of Republicans are quite cross that they've successfully been tarred with Project 2025, because as far as they are concerned, that was just a heritage agenda, and there are other groups coming up with different transition ideas, and Project 2025 wasn't really a central part. But by banging on endlessly about Project 2025, the Democrats have harmed Trump, and he's had to sort of denounce it and say it's nothing to do with him. But the Democrats are going to keep talking about that until they're blue in the face. I think if you want a better idea of what a Trump agenda might be, I would encourage people to look at the America First Policy Institute, which shows that Trump's real agenda, which is probably more closely aligned with what Trump people are thinking, and the real agenda there is energy independence, and a correction on the judiciary. There's a lot of resentment. Another thing I haven't even mentioned yet, which is silly of me, is to talk about the lawfare against Donald Trump, which has sort of vanished in recent weeks. And another reason why a lot of people think he's lost some of his potency is because the great asset for Trump was the Department of Justice's campaign against him for the last 4 years. And it gave him a sort of weird strength, because everybody saw that it was an obviously political campaign. Everybody was disgusted by it, apart from the people who really hate Trump. And every time he was indicted, his popularity would go up. When there was the mugshot taken of him in Fulton County jailhouse, his popularity would go up. And so, sorry, going back to the policy, the part of the Republican agenda is to say there is a sort of deep state. They probably won't use that word so much. Trump will, but others won't. And it's important for the next administration to make sure that no other president can be legally pursued for things he's done in office. And the Supreme Court has supported him on that to an extent. They've said there is presidential immunity on things you do in office. So on the Republican side, I think you're going to have energy as the key one. On the Democrat side, Green New Deal is the key one. And as far as markets are concerned, I think you'll see a lot of people who invest in green energy and the kind of global attempt to combat climate change will be excited by a Harris presidency. On the sort of economic side for Trump, there'll be excitement about a reduction in corporation tax. He seems to be pretty serious about reducing corporation tax to 15%, whereas Harris says she'll do what Biden always said he would do, but hasn't done, and will raise it to 28%. So I think markets will think we prefer a Trump presidency, despite the fact that Trump has said he's going to impose a 10% tariff on all imports to America, which is an extraordinary position, and one that would probably sink the global economy pretty quickly. My view on that, and my view, having spoken to people in Trump's circle, is that this is just a bargaining tactic, like he did with NATO spending with European countries. He pushes them very hard, like he did with Kim Jong-un and North Korea. He pushes them very hard. He pushes them to the brink. They think this guy's completely crazy. He could do it, and then he'll back down. I don't think Trump is going to introduce a 10% tariff on all imports. But with Donald Trump, you can never tell entirely.
One of the key concerns and areas of risk for investors, certainly when looking into US assets, is, of course, the federal government's fiscal deficit, which is looking pretty unsustainable, and the debt load in the American economy as well, weighing down potential growth prospects as well. And neither candidate are essentially talking about the elephant in the room, which is this sort of bubbling debt problem over there. Do you have a view on this? I mean, it's sort of, I guess it's an electoral suicide for both of them to say that, yeah, we're going to put in a balanced budget, we're going to make a huge amount of federal cuts ahead of the election. But do you think either candidate, if they were to win, are going to deal with this problem sort of relatively soon after becoming president?
I think Donald Trump has made noises that he will do that. And that he'll grow the economy sort of faster than the debt grows. I don't think he will. His record in his first term suggests that he won't. I think the sort of democratic pressures to bring down the debt are just not there. Kamala Harris, I think, will be Bidenomics on steroids to some extent. So we'll have massive more spending. Massive increase in debt. And I think the mystery is, to what extent can America keep getting away with it? With the dollar as its as the world's reserve currency, to what extent can America actually just keep, and with its hard power as well, to what extent can America keep inflating its debt? At some point, the pain will have to come. But I don't think either candidate's going to address it very seriously if they win.
I guess again, still keeping with the policy topic at the moment, and how they would be able to enact their policies if they get elected is, of course, what then happens with the government structure in the Senate, and whether we're going to have a supermajority will be helpful for both candidates, of course. Now, would you be able to give us a bit of insight as to how you're seeing the Senate and the House of Representatives sort of looking after the election?
Well, again, things could move in the next few weeks, but at the moment it looks like Democrats will win the House and Republicans might take the Senate. I think if that happens, you will have en passe, you will have what you've had in Congress for the last 20 years, which is a president saying he wants to, sort out fiscal issues, but Congress is getting in the way, and then Congress saying, we're sort of protecting the American economy, we're protecting the American consumer, and this president's agenda is going to, ruin the American economy forever. So I think you will not see any. If it was a split House, which it will be, a split Congress, which it probably will be, you will not see any significant movement. And it conceivably Trump could win a supermajority. I don't think that's the case. I don't think that will happen. And I think you'll see a lot of voters, down ballot voters, particularly people like RFK voters, they might just begrudgingly support Trump, but then they might support a Democrat locally down the ticket. And so you'll see I think American elections are always very complicated and confusing. But I think you won't see, there's not sort of shift to the Republican agenda, and there's not really a great endorsement of the Democratic agenda. So you will see splits, you will see a divided country, you will see an electorate that votes for more impasse, even though if you talk to American voters, the thing they're most frustrated with is that Washington doesn't get stuff done. But they keep coming up with candidates. They keep voting. It's not their fault because it's so complicated and massive. But the democratic system keeps coming up with candidates who aren't able to get stuff done, even if they are sincere about doing stuff.
I think one of the things we've noticed over the last couple of years, at least, is certainly under the previous regime, we always had this situation with the debt ceiling increase as well. That was obviously very combative over the sort of previous 4 years, but it seems as if that hasn't necessarily been an issue once a year under the current Biden administration. Do you see that as a sort of growing risk again in the future if we do have a split house?
I think the tendency among, the international community, the kind of, for want of a better word, sort of the global economy, the tendency to view the Democrats more favorably does mean that markets respond more positively to Biden than they do to Trump in some ways. But fundamentally, I don't think that really alters things. I think fundamentally, Bidenomics has been inflationary. Everybody can see that. The Inflation Reduction Act, which is one of the worst named bits of legislation in history, has added to inflation. Biden's spending has added to inflation. I think there is grave doubts among people in finance about whether Bidenomics is really working. And I think Trump, the markets responded positively to Trump last time. I think they'll respond positively again.
Yeah, and it's interesting, particularly for us as investors looking at sectors you touched on earlier with regards to, it's drill, baby, drill, continuing to drill, baby, drill, because, actually Biden has drilled more barrels of oil than Trump did in his previous presidency. And looking at sector performances and also, with Biden in the presidency, actually all of those renewable energy parts of the market haven't done particularly well. One of the areas, of course, that is a major focus for investors is the tech sector. And with regards to both candidates, are they showing their stripes in terms of more regulation or deregulation on the tech sector? Have you got a view on that?
Kamala Harris has talked about regulating the tech sector. She is obviously, her background is from California. She is sort of pushing herself as someone who considers the law important, similar to Keir Starmer again. She is the person who will stand up for the law against, these overbearing companies and so on. I don't think anyone quite buys it. I don't think anyone thinks that she's going to seriously take on the tech companies, partly because there's a lot of tech money behind her. On just going back to Bidenomics quickly, one of the theories about why Kamala Harris was so swiftly endorsed by the Democratic establishment was that a lot of her donors, people like Reid Hoffman, LinkedIn founder, I think he is, he was putting pressure on her to drop some of the tariffs, to drop some of the more protectionist measures of the Biden economy. And whether she does that or not is an interesting question. But will she be more in hock to tech donors than Biden was is an interesting question. I think she probably will be because they've historically been behind her. So I wouldn't take too seriously her talk about, forcing social media platforms to behave in certain ways. I think there is a speech question. I think, similar to the Labour Party again, sorry to keep drawing that comparison, but it keeps striking me. The Democrats don't really believe in free speech, whereas Donald Trump and the Republicans do. So in terms of sort of social media content, I think Harris may try to introduce some restrictions, but she'll probably back down in the face of the money and the difficulties of doing it. Trump on tech, I think, the money is his oyster, as it were. It was very interesting on TikTok when he was president. He was going to sign an executive order effectively banning TikTok unless it moved into American ownership. Biden has since tried to do that and Trump has opposed it. One theory is that that's because he's realized that he's quite popular on TikTok or certain pockets of TikTok. Another theory is that Americans who have huge investments in TikTok managed to persuade him to let it go, to drop it. And he has. So he is very much, Trump is very transactional in his approach to everything. If it helps him in the moment, he'll do it. And that's why, for all the talk about his kind of America First agenda there is something there. It's not completely fake. I'd argue it's less fake than Kamala Harris. But when push comes to shove, Trump often does the most sensible thing. And on foreign policy, I think that's interesting too, because in Afghanistan, Trump really wanted to pull out of Afghanistan. He was intending to pull out of Afghanistan, but he just, in the moment, he didn't see the upside of doing it. Whereas Biden did it and took a lot of political flack. And you could argue his presidency never really recovered from pulling out of Afghanistan. So Trump is transactional. He'll sort of do whatever it takes. And on tech, I would say, markets would favor a Trump presidency because he believes in deregulation. He is, for all of his protectionism, he is a businessman at heart. Kamala Harris has no business experience, neither does Tim Walz. And so I think the tech sector, and you can see it with Elon Musk, you can see it with people like Mark Zuckerberg, even softening his tone slightly on Trump. I think what's interesting on the Silicon Valley guys is how impressed they were by Trump's response to the shooting, because, they, in their kind of macho tech bro way, they really admired that he sort of stood up and said, fight, fight, fight. And they are increasingly hostile towards the kind of the wokery of the Democrats and the threat that poses to free speech, which in turn poses a threat to their platforms.
Let's move on to foreign policy, because you did touch on it there, and again, there is seemingly quite a bit of difference between the two candidates here with regards to Trump's claim that he'll be able to end the war in Ukraine overnight, and maybe do the same in Gaza as well, whereas Kamala Harris seems to have doubled down on Biden with her support for Ukraine. Should we just touch on the sort of wars and sort of the policy to either ultimately continue or to stop them, as a contrasting policy between the two candidates to start with, and then we'll just move on to slightly wider matters as well.
Well, I think Ukraine and Gaza are obviously the most pressing issues, but I think the bigger, more looming foreign policy issue for America is, of course, China. And Trump, it looks like Trump might pick Elbridge Colby as his national security advisor. Elbridge Colby is a very interesting figure. I've interviewed him. He is obsessed with the idea that America is almost inevitably going to fight a war with China. And so all the questions of Gaza, questions of Ukraine, he's regarding that, and I think people in Trump world are regarding that in the context of what's it mean about China. Kamala Harris wants to continue the Biden approach to China, which is challenge but cooperate. So challenge over chip manufacturing, but cooperate where possible. And this sort of awkward dance will carry on, I think, if she wins. On Gaza, on Ukraine, on Gaza, I think Harris is in a very difficult position, particularly if she wins, she gets into power, and the war in Gaza is still ongoing. She will find herself having to support Israel because of the pressures to do that. But she will find herself extremely unpopular with the left of her party as she does that. Trump on Gaza, he had this very interesting line about Israel in the early phase when Israel was sort of really struggling in a sort of PR sense, and people were very angry and understandably disgruntled about what that people are calling a genocide. Trump said Israel just needs to get on with it, which is a very brutal and horrible thing to say. But really, that's what all Democrats are thinking too. So I think that I would say that Trump is, David Chappelle famously called him a more honest liar. And Trump is a more honest liar in the sense that he is much more straightforward about foreign policy. So on Gaza, I think Trump will support Israel undoubtedly, but will do it in a much more clear-cut way. There won't be any of this kind of half trying to signal sympathy for the Palestinians. He'll just try and get it done and get it over quickly. That's what he wants to do in Ukraine as well. I don't buy his idea that he's going to wrap it up within 24 or 48 hours. I do think inevitably, though, the conflict in Ukraine has to reach some sort of end. I think you're seeing with the invasion of Russia, the attacks on Russia, you're seeing Zelensky trying to position himself for a final negotiating point. I don't know if how the Democrats would handle supporting him. They seem to think that just endlessly funding Ukraine is a coherent policy. I think Trump is more clear on the fact that the war cannot go on forever, that the war is strengthening China, that Russia is not actually suffering from the war, and that, in terms of getting it wrapped up, getting some sort of, it will never wrap up, but getting some sort of negotiation, compromise, peace, settlement is essential. So I think, I think Putin has said that he would rather Biden won the election. And everybody, this was obviously before Biden pulled out the race, and everybody thought that was Putin being, typically Putin, trolling and so on. I'm not sure that is the case. I think Putin genuinely didn't know how to handle Trump because he is so unpredictable and so hard to read. And I think, Russia, although obviously the Ukraine war has been a disaster for them in many ways, if you look at foreign policy in a more macro way, you look at Afghanistan, you look at Russia's growing friendship with China and the emergence of that bloc and the emergence of the BRICS and so on. For Putin's worldview, America is more in decline with Biden, and that's good for him, than it was with Trump.
Well, as you say, you might well be a transactional sort of a relationship again with these strong men across the world. It's going to suit Trump to just maintain. We got to maintain America's strength, and if that means then we have to give up some of our global influence, then so be it.
Yes, and I mean it's also worth thinking about the Abraham Accords, which were these extraordinary deals struck between Arab states, brokered by Biden and particularly his son-in-law Jared Kushner. And that was to a large extent listening to Israel and trying to find Israel's way out of problems in the Middle East. And it was effective. You did have these extraordinary breakthroughs, and you may well have had, the Biden administration even tried to keep it going. You may well have had some sort of serious accord between Saudi Arabia and Israel, which would have been incredible, unthinkable just a few years ago. That obviously has been completely undermined by the war in Gaza, and Trump can keep pointing to his record as foreign policy as a president, that no new wars under his watch. There's been no new direct wars for America under Biden or Harris's watch, but there have been a lot of there's been a lot of problems in Gaza, and Ukraine has obviously happened, and the world does feel more unstable. And people object to Republicans talking about the possibility of World War III. But the world is much more unstable and has been under a Biden administration. That's not necessarily all Joe Biden's fault. But Trump can say, and this is an issue in American politics, he can say the world was more stable when I was president. And a lot of Americans, polls suggest this, a lot of Americans think that.
And how is the new UK government going to approach both candidates? I think we know who the preference would be from the Starmer perspective, but a number of the new Labour front bench have said pretty derogatory comments towards Donald Trump in the past. Spend a few minutes on Starmer's approach to the winning candidate.
Well, it's been very funny to watch Labour's sort of pivoting on this. David Lammy famously called Trump a KKK sympathizer and other things. And then when it was Trump Biden and it looked very obvious that Trump was going to win, you saw a Labour world and Lammy and his advisors, someone called Ben Judah in particular, making approaches to Trump world. And these two groups of people that essentially hate each other, talking to each other, and trying to sort of agree to what they would agree on with a Labour and a Labour administration and a Trump administration. Then Harris emerges, and suddenly Labour feel very excited about the possibility of more Bidenomics, because Rachel Reeves' Securenomics is very modelled on Bidenomics. They are just more comfortable dealing with Democrats, and that's true of the Tories too. The Tories were never comfortable dealing with Trump world. They much prefer dealing with Democrats because they think that Trump world is insane and far right. And so on the side of Harris, I think you will see more. There was at the convention, there was 3 or 4 Labour people came and they talked about how the centre left, they would call it the centre left, how the centre left can reconnect with the working classes, which is the great dilemma for all left of centre parties. And they would talk about housing, and that was really it. That's all they have as an idea. And similar to the Labour Party, you know, that's housing is obviously a big issue, and they think that if you can focus on housing, then that's great. So whereas Labour were sort of looking to Bidenomics as their lodestar, their guiding light for how to handle the economy, how to handle big questions. Now, Democrats are weirdly looking at Labour Party and their electoral success and saying, this is the model we can use. So they're looking at housing in the same way. And I think that's very interesting. If Trump wins, you'll see Lamy reconnecting in foreign policy terms, trying to desperately curry favour with the Trump administration. But they are obviously very opposed. I mean, Starmer is sotto voce anti-Brexit. Trump's very pro-Brexit. You know, that their worldviews are so different, it'll be hard to see how they align. I would say, though, that I think the power of Trump hatred has waned. And it's not, you know, it's not just because David Lammy is a politician and he'll say anything, that he's no longer calling Trump a KKK sympathizer. I just don't think there's the public appetite in Britain for denouncing Trump as far right. I think people have now accepted that Trump is a real political phenomenon. And that you have to accept eventually that if he has all this support, America is the most powerful country in the world. If Americans want to vote for Donald Trump, you have to accept that a Trump administration is a reality and not just some aberration. So whereas in 2016, people were just so shocked and horrified by Trump, and you had sort of endless resistance against him. In 2024, I don't think people in government feel the same way. I think they've accepted him as a reality of political life.
Let's just move back to the Trump camp. Back in 2016, I think we can all agree it was widely sort of unexpected that he was going to win. I don't think he even knew he was going to win. Indeed, he might not have wanted to win, was some of the rumours. And so he brought some sort of really good people around him into his cabinet to sort of help him through that transition. And obviously, some of those key individuals have fallen away and fallen out of favour with Trump. So have you got any, you mentioned one name already with regards to a cabinet position, but what is your view on how he's going to populate some of the key other positions within the cabinet?
I think a bit like giving out sort of baubles to disappointed people. I think you'll see Doug Burgum, who was thought to be a vice presidential pick, getting a substantial role, energy, possibly. Some people say Secretary of State. I'm not sure about that. Marco Rubio, again, who was thought to be a possible vice presidential pick, will get a role. But you'll also see him bringing in businessmen and kind of people he thinks know how to handle business. That's what he did in 2016. We don't know which businessmen yet. I think there are lots of rumors. I wouldn't buy too much into it. I think Trump acknowledges that in 2016, he did not handle the transition well. I mean, he'll never acknowledge it publicly, but I think in private, he would admit that, because he felt that Washington, having, you know, opposed him so viciously, the institutions of government having opposed him so viciously, once he was elected, everybody would just accept that he had won, and they would all fall into line and the transition would happen. And he was also very chaotic. It was a very chaotic campaign. It's a much, Trumpism and the America First movement is a much more serious creature now. And they have clear ideas on what they want to do on energy, on education, and so on. And so you will see a more comprehensive agenda. And that is what really terrifies Democrats. And that's what they want to call Christian nationalism and so on, because they feel that they kind of got away with it in the first Trump administration. And they'd say the institutions of government stood firm against Trumpism. But actually, I think the institutions of government probably won't be able to stand firm against a second Trump administration. So I think in terms of staffing, it's hard to say. That you won't see a project, to repeat, you won't see a Project 2025 agenda enacted to the letter. It'll be a mix of differing groups, of differing interests. And Trump is, as famously, he is like a cushion that wears the impression of the last bottom that sat on him. And so it just happens to be who gets close to him in those crucial moments during the transition that will be decided. I don't think there is a clear idea. There is some thinking that J.D. Vance will be much more involved in policy, because he is much more he has a much more detailed mind than Trump. And the thinking is that he will, as a younger man, he will be able to turn the America First movement into a serious governing force. Again, whether Trump goes along with that is a different question.
I'm just conscious of the time. We've got a few minutes left, and I think actually some of the questions that have come through we've already covered off. But there's still a couple of minutes for anyone to send an email if they want to ask a question. But if we roll forward to November the 5th, or indeed November the 6th, and we get to the result, and it's a nail biter, it's unbelievably close, like it was last time. What is your opinion on whether Trump is going to challenge the result, or indeed, are we going to have to wait a number of days to get a final result? And what could the implications be if Trump challenges? Because he seems to be laying the groundwork already for a potential challenge.
I think it's going to be a contested election in some ways, either by Trump or by Harris. It's worth remembering that Democrats have often said that elections were rigged or somehow fraudulent when they lose. It's not just Donald Trump that does it, although Donald Trump has done it on a more spectacular scale than anyone else. I think one of the things to remember about 2020 was what a strange election it was. There was the pandemic, which meant that Biden was able to run this very sort of basement campaign, as Republicans called it, where he didn't really expose himself to the public very much. But B, there was a huge expansion of mail-in voting. I mean, vast. And he would not have won the election if it wasn't for that vast expansion of mail-in voting. There'll be less mail-in voting this time, we think. I mean, I could be wrong about that, but we think. And that you would think would favor Trump. But it's hard to say because Republicans used to have an advantage with mail-in voting. They now no longer do. I think that he will, if he loses, he will say it was rigged. His phrase is that he wants to win in a way that's too big to rig. That's the phrase he uses. And so he means that it's beyond fraud. It is beyond fraud. How people will react to Trump saying it's rigged is an interesting question. I think Americans, actually, if you look at polls on whether they think the 2020 election was fair, a surprising number of Americans don't think it was fair. But what Americans don't like all electorates, is they don't like people grumbling about the results. They want people to just get on with it. They want their lives to be ordered well, and so on. And so I don't think that Trump's if he has a massive tantrum about the election, I think people will just say, we're done with him, let's move on. The implication that has for Republican Party, which is now the party of Trump, is very interesting. If Vance takes it over, it will probably become a less significant force. And something I've written about is whether Trumpism becomes a bit like Marine Le Pen and the Front National or Rassemblement Général in France does it become this bloc that always means the Democrat wins, because the Republican Party is split between the sort of more centrist right and the populist right, which will only ever win about 30%? Or are the winds of change with a more nationalist, a more working class majority culture in America? That is a question I don't know the answer to. But in answer to your question, yes, I think if Harris loses, she will say it was rigged. It's worth remembering the Democrats had kind of a plan in place to contest the election if Trump won in 2020. So American democracy is not in a very healthy condition. It's not like there's sort of honor in the political culture where people just accept losses. And I think that is what voters want. Surveys suggest over and over that voters want a culture where people work together. If they lose the election, you're not going to get that.
And I mean, January the 6th, that still sort of rings very sort of close by this, and it's overhanging still this election. Do you, I mean, it's very hard to predict, but, because it's so polarized, American society, do you foresee any sort of form of violence coming after the election?
Well, I've written some pieces for the Daily Mail about the likelihood of civil war, but that's probably more to do with with tabloid style than reality. I mean, I don't think it's impossible that you have a breakdown of the United States in the near future. You know, would California go along with a second Trump administration is a difficult question to answer. I think you could see a lot of people just will not accept Donald Trump as their president. And I think a lot of people will not accept Kamala Harris as their president. And that is a dangerous situation to be in. Having said that, journalists like me always tend to exaggerate the possibility of violence and upheaval. And actually, most people just want to get on with their lives.
I've got a couple of questions. We'll just finish on these. We have spoken about regional wars, but we haven't actually spoken specifically about a policy on defence. One of the questions is, will both candidates commit to spending more on defence?
I think Kamala Harris interestingly will. She is trying to signal that she is a kind of almost like a Bush era Republican on certain things like defence of freedom and patriotism, and what she calls making sure that America has the most lethal force. That could all be hot air, and when it gets to the reality of government, she won't do anything. Trump is, desperate. He loves generals. He's always loved impressing men in uniform. He will always, I think, commit to spending American money on defense. I think given the instability in the world, whoever wins this election, I don't think defense contractors would be a bad bet, or indeed BlackRock, as Bobby Kennedy would tell you.
Next question is, can we assume that Trump will dump green issues?
Not necessarily. Interestingly, there's Robert F. Kennedy as part of his transition team, or is as a co-chair of a sort of temporary transition team. And Robert F. Kennedy is a great environmentalist. He's not a kind of climate change environmentalist in the sort of international sense. He's very skeptical about, big oil companies pretending to be green and so on. But you may well see him getting Trump to agree on domestic environmental concerns like protecting rainforests and protecting, whether they drill in Alaska and things. There'll be pressure on Trump on that. And he will want to signal that he's listening to those concerns. It's worth remembering that Republicans are, in terms of environmental protections, Republicans have often been at the forefront of it. Richard Nixon set up the Environmental Protection Agency, which is often thought of as this sort of terribly left-wing thing. But I think the environmental issue will become more nuanced under a Trump administration than we think. And if it's because of Bobby Kennedy switching a few of those votes in swing states, Trump will reward him. And he must have been promised something to do that. And I think it will be some environment role. Again, though, on terms of like COP agenda, big global stuff, yes, Trump will pull away from all that. He doesn't care about that. And I think a lot of the markets, a lot of the markets are very on board with that. But I think that a lot of the kind of smaller energy market stuff respond very positively to that.
Mm. And one last question from the audience is there a danger that the US under Trump becomes too protectionist? So, I mean, to your point about tariffs earlier, perhaps they link into that.
There's certainly the danger. I think if they're serious about the 10% tariff on all imports, that is, potentially very destructive. And I think it comes down to China. I mean, to what extent can Trump decouple from China, and to what extent is he bluffing? Is he posing? It's worth remembering he actually always tried to work with the Chinese while presenting this very tough front on tariffs. So yeah, I think America is moving in a more protectionist direction, whoever is president. That's the way the global economy seems to be going. I'm not sure Trump represents a dramatic acceleration of it in the way that a lot of people fear.
Great, thanks, Fred. I'm going to leave the hardest question to the last. That's from me. As things currently stand, and we may have to hold you to it, who do you think is going to win on November 5th?
I hate this question, and I keep going back and forth on it. I just think it's going to be extremely close. I think it will be contested no matter what. I think something in October is going to decide it. But as things stand, I think, I was going to say Harris. I think Donald Trump will win. I think Harris will come apart in the coming weeks. But if she doesn't, then as things stand at the moment, she's going to win, I think. But in the coming weeks, I think her inability to answer significant questions, her inability to articulate policies, will tell. And I think Trump will have a resurgence. At the moment, the momentum is against him, but these things always come in tides. And I think Trump is very good at sort of running into a campaign. So, the last few days of a campaign will be crucial.
Brilliant. Well, all eyes on next week's debate, I would suggest, is the next key thing to watch for people.
Definitely. It'll be awful, and it will be fascinating.
Freddie, thank you so much for your time. It's been really insightful as always. I hope everyone watching has enjoyed this webinar. There will be a recording as well that we will send around to those who have attended and for those who haven't. So thanks again, Freddie, and thank you to everyone who's watched this webinar.